Good morning, everybody. Or as I would say normally, Kemek Nianga, Chalingmara Kungarakan. And I acknowledge Kungarakan and Warai people in the room here today, and so pleased to have traditional owner custodians attending. As we welcome this Larrakia man here today, Dr. Curtis Roman, who's from the Aboriginal Interpreter Service, and his presentation today in our own language, the Aboriginal Interpreter Service in the Northern Territory. And as you know, we live stream to other places, and if there are questions at the end, we'll try and cover those too. But right now, I just want to introduce Dr. Roman to come up to the podium. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Is this thing fine? All good? Thank you to everybody for coming today, and I want to acknowledge that I'm on Kanarakan and Warai country and acknowledge the Kanarakan and Warai people here today. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you to present at this very important seminar series. I work at the Aboriginal Interpreter Service, as does my colleague over here, Ramon, and I'm going to talk about the Aboriginal Interpreter Service, the work that we do on a daily basis, why that's important, and some of the challenges that we have and how we sort of work around those challenges together as a team. Hey, how you going? See these people? I see some familiar faces in the audience here. Okay, so the Aboriginal Interpreter Service, we have offices in Darwin, Katherine, Tennant Creek, Alice Springs, Wadeye, Warramiyanga in the Tiwi Islands, and Galawinku. Prior to a recent machinery of government change, we had about 55 full-time staff who were across all of those offices, and we had approximately 200 casual interpreters who were based all over the Northern Territory. We also provide interpreting services in the APY lands and the NPY lands through some cross-border funding that we receive from the Commonwealth to provide interpreting services in those two locations. So we have different teams that come together to allow us to do the work that we do, and it's really important that that we acknowledge that all of those teams are important. None of those teams are more important than any of the other teams. So everybody in the AIS is important to us having a common goal and achieving our objectives, which is high quality service provision of interpreting services. So we have a bookings team. So this is the team that people ring when they want to book an interpreter. So what's one of the important things there, you think, when you ring up our bookings area and you want to book an interpreter? Norforce? Law, yeah. So absolutely. We do a lot of law jobs. We get funding to provide interpreting services in the courts. When you ring up the AIS and you want to book an interpreter, what's one of the important things? Language. So people might ring us up and say, I want an interpreter who speaks Aboriginal. But there's no such language, of course. So in our booking sheets, we make sure that people understand they have to put that detail in there, the language, the gender, and any other issues that allow us to get the best interpreter based on our knowledge of communities and our interpreter workforce for that interpreting assignment. So we don't just send anybody, we need to make sure that they're the right people for that job. We have a recordings team, and that team do recordings in Aboriginal languages for our clients. So our clients might come to us and say, can you do these recordings in Amajara or Walpuri? and we'll get our interpreters to come into our studio that we have in the office, and they'll do those recordings. They go through a whole process, and the outcome of that is high quality recordings that Aboriginal people understand in their own languages. We have a training team. That's a very important part of our business, because that team is really crucial to us becoming and being and providing interpreting services. That's because our core business is the provision of Aboriginal interpreting services. We are not there to provide language speakers. So it's very important that people understand when they use our services that we don't just send people who speak that language. We send people who are trained and qualified interpreters. And there is a big difference. So if somebody says to me, oh, it's okay, this person over here speaks their language, we don't need an interpreter. You know what I say to them? How do you know? How do you know? Do you speak that language? Does that person want that person to know their business? Are you breaching confidentiality from the outset? How do you know that? And what if something goes wrong? So typically if something goes wrong, people have covered themselves if they've used a trained and qualified interpreter. Okay? And you're showing respect to the person who needs the interpreter. Okay? We have a training liaison team, and that team is responsible for recruiting interpreters and then providing them with support. So providing interpreters with support is absolutely crucial to our business, because we have interpreters who will do things like end-of-life interpreting, and that can be for a couple of months. They can be involved in, really serious violent crime, interpreting in those situations. They can be interpreting in situations where people are having, custody battles. A whole range of issues they can be involved in where they require support. So we don't just send them and say, there you go, come back and we'll send you to another job. We need to make sure that we are providing them with the support that they need. That's really important. We have an operations and reporting team, another very important team, and what that team does is manage and collate our statistics. So because we receive funding from different levels of government, we've got to be able to report on what we're doing and whether we are achieving those funding expectations. Or if I've got to draft up some high level correspondence, for example, I'll go to that team and say, can you get me this data? They'll get it for me and I'll draft up that correspondence. We have an admin team and a couple of directors. So we are one of two government Aboriginal Interpreter Services in the NT. At the moment, we're the only government service provider that delivers Aboriginal interpreting services. South Australia are in the process of establishing an Aboriginal Interpreter Service, but they haven't started delivering services yet. We also are unique in the way that we provide interpreting services for languages all over the NT. So you might have a language centre in one particular region that can provide interpreting services for languages in that region only. Whereas we provide interpreting services for all over the Northern Territory. What else is there? So that's really a little bit of background about us, and these are the services that we provide on a daily basis. Face-to-face interpreting, AVL interpreting. So when a client wants to talk to somebody by video or computer, face things, they'll ring us, we put them through to our rosters that we have in our office, and the interpreter will be able to talk to that service provider and the language speaking client. We have rosters, so we have rosters in the hospitals and we have court rosters. So one of the things, when we have rosters, it's really important for us to make sure that the language demand is there for the interpreter that we're providing. Gender representation is important. The other thing that we do, as I said, is recorded messages. So last year we received the Chief Minister's Award for Public Sector Excellence for recorded messages around COVID-19. So people were able to get information about COVID-19 in their own languages, which is really important because those messages changed quickly. The terminology changed. It went from social distancing to physical distancing. And terminology can be important in cross-cultural communication. So it was very important that we were able to do that work, and for that team, they were recognised for it, which is fantastic. We also do interpreter professional development training. As I said, the difference between us providing language services and interpreting services is that our interpreters receive professional development training. So we don't just go and get somebody who claims to speak the language. We provide trained interpreters. We do working with interpreter training. So this is where we work with service providers, people who deliver services to Aboriginal people, and show them how to get the most out of working with interpreters. Because a lot of people have never worked with interpreters. And a lot of people will get up the front and they'll go really fast, talking flat out, and then half an hour later somebody's got to say, hey, what about the interpreter? And, from the outset it's not a good start. So it takes a bit of skill and understanding how to work with interpreters. I remember I worked with an interpreter once, previous to being in the AIS, and I did it wrong. I got up the front, I kept talking, blah, 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 blah. And then when they told me, oh no, you got to go back, all of my enthusiasm was gone. So it was a pretty poor speech after that. And that was with Indigenous people from Taiwan who had an interpreter. It wasn't in Taiwan, it was in Darwin. We do radio news broadcasts. So you might have heard our radio broadcasts on the ABC radio in languages. One day me and Derek was driving home and he said, oh, put the radio on, put the radio on. He was on the radio. So I turned it off. But it's really important for people to get that level of information in their own languages. And working in the radio, doing these radio messages can be intimidating if you do it for the first time, because you're going in there, you've got to talk differently, you've got all this equipment in front of you, the timing's different, and it takes a bit of time for people to get the confidence to do it. We do emergency response messaging. So you might have seen us doing live to air news broadcasts with senior people in the government, senior police officers, senior people in the Bureau of Meteorology, talking about floods, talking about cyclone activity. We do that as well, and our interpreters do that very well. And as I said, it just provides people in those regions where that activity is present or forecast to understand things in their own language. So why would you use the Aboriginal Interpreter Service? Because our interpreters are trained and qualified and they work to national standards. They've got to go through a process internally with us that satisfies our requirements before we allow them to go out there and do interpreting. Because if they go out there and they're not ready, we can't take that back. So we need to make sure that they're trained and they're qualified and they're good at what they're doing, because these are the guys who are, you know, helping their people to understand things that's happening to them. So it's really important. As I said, we're the only government provider of Aboriginal interpreting services in the NT, and we provide interpreting services for languages all over the NT. We tend to sort of have most demand for 18 of the most commonly used Aboriginal languages. We screen interpreters to ensure the best interpreter for each job. That's really important, because if that doesn't take place, the language speaker, who is the client, might be uncomfortable if we send the wrong person. And they might leave the service provider, or we might have to go back and do the whole process again about getting somebody in. What if they've got an avoidance relationship with somebody and we send that person? What it shows is that we're not culturally aware, and that it shows that we don't know our own core business. So we need to make sure we don't do those things. So we screen to get the best interpreter. So we assist with quality service provision and culturally safe service provision. You couldn't get anything more culturally safe than people getting information in their own language. And sometimes that communication has to be gender specific, in health, in a number of legal situations, you know, domestic violence situations, etc. Custody situations. So we are a local service, and we have our staff all over the Northern Territory, and that means we have a lot of local knowledge about community issues, how to work with communities, how to recruit interpreters, how to support interpreters, and how to get the best interpreter for each incoming interpreting assignment. What's the next one? So, working with interpreters. Put your hand up if you've worked with an interpreter before. Not too many people, yeah? It's one of those things, I suppose, often we don't get the opportunity to do. And it's really important if you're the language speaker. And if we're not the language speaker, we probably take it for granted. So find a quiet place where there are no distractions. Sometimes that's not achievable, depending on the service provider. They can be very busy, have staff limitations, etc. Yeah. Sit in a triangle shape. You know, the service provider there, the interpreter here, the language speaker there. That's really important when documenting communication. And sometimes it's really important to document communication. If you're the service provider who's got an interpreter to come and help you, you focus on the language speaker, not the interpreter. The interpreter will do the interpreting. Okay? So talk directly to the client, avoid he said, she said sort of terminology, avoid jargon and acronyms. I mean, you know, service providers typically shouldn't use it anyway. And coming from the Australian Institute of Sport, I know that. Because unless you're employed with an agency, how do you know what those acronyms mean? I'm not from the Australian Institute of Sport, I'm from the same acronym. Nothing alike. So speak slowly and clearly, one concept at a time. Don't go too fast. Sometimes it's hard not to when you've had 3 coffees in the last hour. and you've got other things to do. Be patient, because interpreters need to explain things differently. So they might not have words in their language for a certain word, yeah? So they might not have words for medical procedure. They might not have word for theatre. They might not have a word for affidavit, yeah? So you've got to allow them to put things into their own language, but it doesn't change the message. People think in their language too, they don't just talk in it. And that's really important. So allow interpreters and clients time to understand and think. Pause at important points. And summarise conversations at the end, so everybody knows what's happening before they all walk off, yeah? So anytime you're working in cross-cultural situations, there is no silver bullet. There is no magic pill. I know a lot of people search for it, but there isn't one. So when you're in a cross-cultural situation and you don't speak each other's language, you communicate more, even if you're wrong in your interpretation of that communication. It doesn't matter. Through your body language, your tone of voice, facial expressions, all of those things are really important in cross-cultural communication. Often words have different meanings to people, Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory. So when Aboriginal people say business, what do they mean often in the Northern Territory? Business. They're talking about shops. They're talking about financial transactions, or they're talking about ceremonies. Talking about ceremonies, yeah? Culture. When Aboriginal people are talking about culture, they're not talking about getting up in the morning, have a coffee and checking your emails, because that's part of contemporary culture. They're talking about traditional Aboriginal culture. Deadly. That doesn't mean something is dangerous or poisonous. It means something is really good. Yeah? Mob in the Northern Territory, Aboriginal people don't use mob in the same way as Aboriginal people from interstate use that word. We say, where's your country? Who's your family? We don't say, who's your mob? We might say, them mob, or that mob, or big mob, but it's used in a totally different context in the Northern Territory. That's my observations. Country, again, you know, when country could be a word that's used when you're talking to an Aboriginal language speaker, and it has a totally different meaning. You know, people can have their mother's country and their father's country. They could be living somewhere that's not their country. Can have totally different meanings to it. Countryman. It's used differently again in the Northern Territory. Kinship terms. So somebody might call 3 people their mother, yeah? And of course their mothers are sisters, yeah? So those terms are used differently as well. What else is on there? So yeah, family members should not be interpreters. And that is to ensure impartiality. Because you don't want someone making decisions on behalf of someone, or you don't want someone who you don't know can speak that language. So oftentimes people will get a family member without thinking, well, guess what? That family member over there who needs the interpreter might not want that person to know their personal business. It's the same as any other client. What else is there? So Talked about that, summarising points, in focusing on the interpreter and the client differently. We've covered that, so we'll just keep moving. So at the Aboriginal Interpreter Service, up until this recent machinery of government change, probably about 95% of our workforce were Aboriginal. And in the main, they were traditional Aboriginal people. So we had about 180 to 200 casual interpreters. All of those people were, of course, language speakers, and all of those people were traditional Aboriginal people. We have to contend with remoteness. People live in, well, to them they're not living remote, they've always lived there. But in terms of service provision in town, it's remote. We're remote to them. We've got traditional Aboriginal people with cultural obligations that are always going to be their priority. That's their main business. Pardon the pun. Remember I said business? Professional development issues. So we need to make sure that we are focusing on their professional development and just saying, not just having them in our workforce, but making sure that they're getting opportunities to develop and being very genuine about those professional development opportunities. Casual staff. So most of our interpreter workforce, by a long way really, are casual staff. So we can't really provide our service to the to meet our demand without that number of casual staff. And as I said before, in my experience, whenever you're working cross-culturally, don't try to read a 1,000-word manual. Bring in your own experiences, what do you think? That's always the best place to start. What are your experiences? So there's no guide, respect it. So, you know, on a daily basis, my approach is that I respect staff at all levels. I'm inclusive. I don't want to have an idea without other people contributing to that idea. It's a team idea. What do you guys think about this? How could we do this better? Tell me. And important in that is the interpreters who are from traditional backgrounds. Have an open door policy at all times. It's really important that people feel comfortable coming to see me, regardless of whether they're casual employees, regardless of whether they're at senior levels or not. That doesn't matter. That's irrelevant. No egos. I don't have time for egos. They don't help anyone. Because we need to work together to get the outcomes. And working as a team is the best way to do that. Communication is really important. It's always really important to have communication with people because they don't know what's going on and they really should know what's going on. So I always communicate with people. And what's one of the most important things about communication? It's on there, you can see it there. Listening, yeah. It's not just about talking. It's really important to be a good listener. Because if you're not a good listener, you think people will keep listening to you? You think they'll feel like they are valued? You think they'll give you 110%? It's really important. And of course, what's really important as well is not just to say it, but to apply it every day. So, to me, those are the things that I think are important. I don't need to read any 1,000-word guide to tell me that. So these are some of our current projects. The ABC radio that you guys are aware of already. The emergency call centre, so we were involved in a trial project there that was initiated by the Aboriginal Justice Unit Agency, and that was about us having interpreters in the emergency call centre. So that was a really good project. It was really important for us to be there. We valued the opportunity to be there, and that meant that our interpreters would go and work there 3 days a week from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. weekdays. They had to be there. And the emergency call centre is in Darwin only, so we, fortunately for us, we had a high-level nationally certified Aboriginal interpreter who's an Amajara speaker in Darwin, who was able to go and do that. And it was really important for Aboriginal language speakers to be able to ring up and talk to somebody in their own language in those situations. Hospital ward rounds, so we were involved in a trial project there, which was a really important one because it involved the interpreters being at the coalface of daily communication with health professionals. They were there. And what's really important about those situations is the language speaker is able to ask questions. And that's really important. So what else is there? The AFLNT. So if you're looking for something that is going to get you lots of traction with Aboriginal people, what do you reckon that would be? Football, yeah. So we teamed up with the AFLNT. We got some funding to have a camp. So there was one language we needed to recruit more language speakers for. And so we said, okay, well, let's have this camp. Let's bring these interpreters into Darwin. They'll stay at the Michael Long Centre for the week. They'll establish good relationships with each other. They'll do our training. At the end of the week, they'll be inducted into our interpreter workforce. And then when they go back to their community, they can support each other while they're there. So doing that with the AFLNT was quite significant. Public symposiums. So I think it was 2019, it was the International Year of Indigenous Languages. So I rang up the CDU and I rang up Bachelor and I said, let's have a symposium and let's get some speakers together and talk about Indigenous languages. And so we did that together, the three of us, and there were probably over 100 people attend that symposium. So the people involved in it from Bachelor were Nicoletta and Paula, and there were a few from Bachelor involved in that, so that was really good. The year after that, we did a symposium with CDU. Again, that was attended by about 100 people. The year after that, we did a symposium with Menzies School of Health Research, talking about interpreting communication and healthcare. That was attended by 100 people. And then by popular demand, the year later, like Mick Jagger, we did another one. Yeah, so that was good because it was an opportunity for us to communicate to a large amount of people from different backgrounds, while language and interpreting is important in different situations. And it's really important for us to go out and make sure people know about our business. Because for them to use our business, they've got to know about us. So that's really important. So we did those. We got a Prime Minister's Eye Awards before my time. Derek was there about police cautions in Aboriginal languages, which was really important. We recently got some funding from the Public Health Network to develop a health dictionary to train our interpreters when they're working in healthcare contexts. We got some This is an interesting one. We recently got some funding from Diabetes Australia. And guess what we're doing? We're developing Australia's first ever diabetes resource in Aboriginal languages. So we're going to obviously get our high level, high experienced interpreters to make sure that we're doing languages from each of the regions. It's really important that we are not, you know, the last thing we are is top end focus. We focus on all of the regions. We're doing some collaboration with the health department about sexually transmitted infections, so people can use that in their own languages. That can be challenging because it's a sort of a sensitive gender topic. But those things I mentioned earlier, respect, being inclusive, what do you think, how can we do this how you want to do it, that allows us to get the outcomes that we want. They're not just words. As I said last year, we got a Chief Minister's Award for Public Sector Excellence for the work we've done around COVID-19. We were the first Aboriginal interpreter service to provide interpreting in Parliament, and that was through two of our Jamparapangu interpreters, Derek being one of them. I can't help but mention Derek because he's right in front of me here. He should have sat down the back. Leave now. So what else is there? We're doing some research, a research project with University of New South Wales on interpreters being in courts. We've got a range of projects, but obviously with these projects you've got to make sure you just stretch them out, get them finished, then you start on new ones. Yeah, because you don't want to start projects, we can all do that. We want to finish them. So these are some of the challenges that we face, sort of misconceptions if you like. Oh no, it's okay, you know, we've got someone who speaks the language. We don't need an interpreter. And I say, well, how do you know that? Because they told me. Well, all right. But we promote the use of trained interpreters. Using family members again, we want impartiality and we want to respect confidentiality. I've worked with Aboriginal people before. That doesn't mean anything in the context of interpreting. And we're not trying to say that it doesn't. We're just saying that interpreting means that you can use the language and you're trained to do it. And you're recognised to do it. He doesn't seem to need an interpreter. Again, it's an assumption because they haven't even asked him or her. Kinship obligations. So what's one kinship obligation that might be you've got to have challenges. That is something that we might be able to navigate around. Gender, avoidance, age.
In terms of like challenges, like do you have like cluster groups of interpreters on communities, based on communities?
Yeah, yeah.
They have courts and
Yeah. Yeah.
People in Australia, you know, watered that down and probably around the world too as well.
Yeah.
In terms of the high incarceration rate, so are they on call or do they have like offices out like?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we have some interpreting staff who are office-based, sort of permanent staff who sit in the office like the rest of us. And then we have casual interpreters, and those casual interpreters, they can live in a community, and then, you know, 3 months later they can be in town living. So they're sort of like transient. Some of them live in the communities, and, you know, at times we might not be able to get a hold of them, so we try to get another one. And you know, often we'll take somebody from a community and bring them into town for a job, and vice versa. We'll take somebody from in town to bush courts, for example. But we do get a significant amount of our funding to provide legal interpreting, because that's really important. And one of the things that we do there is make sure that our interpreters have satisfied the requirements to be a level 3 interpreter, because we don't want them going into the courtroom unless they have really shown us that they can do that and do it well, because we can't take that back.
Does that mean they have to have some legal background as well?
No, we as part of the training, we make sure that we provide them with legal training and health training in there. So yeah, good question that the Aboriginal people are overrepresented in the criminal justice system. So yeah, it's one of the, and that's a really important thing, because one of our challenges there is, so people might not want to participate in some legal proceedings for a range of reasons. They might feel uncomfortable, or they might feel as though that they're going to be blamed for participating in legal proceedings. So good question. Where are we here? Yeah, all that sort of stuff that we've just covered. Got to win mine. So booking an interpreter, we have a 24-hour booking number, because people don't just need interpreters during business hours. They might need them after hours, accidents, you know, whatever the situation is. We prefer bookings are made 48 hours in advance to give us enough time to get the best interpreter. Yeah. Provide as much information as possible. Okay. So that's questions for you now. Yeah.
I was just going to ask, are interpreters also translators?
No, that's a good question. I'm glad you asked that question, because people come to us and they say they want something translated, and we say no, we don't do translation services, because they're written translations. And I suppose some languages do written translations, but the issue is that not many people learn to read those translations, and yeah.
Well, so if
Yep.
you're working on the health issue,
Yep.
that would be have a translation on
No, it's sort of like it's in plain language, plain English, so that the interpreters are able to understand something that's medical jargon. What is diabetes? What does coronary mean? You know, what does theatre mean? What does consent mean? In plain English. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
I've got two questions. One is, what if you can't get them face-to-face? An interpreter face-to-face?
Telephone, AVL, recorded messages, video, video. Or if not, we'll let you know up front to say whether we have difficulty getting an interpreter. Can you book another date?
And the hospital, so they must have some interpreters, but I'm assuming not enough. So is there an opinion on that?
We work together, and I suppose the thing is there's lots of different languages, lots of gender issues in health, lots of kinship issues in health. So we're constantly working together to try to make it as best as possible.
Yeah. Do you, and if there, like if there is an interpreter available, I'm assuming the procedures and things just go forward. Do you think that's an ethical?
It depends on the situation. Depends on the situation, yeah. It's hard to give one response to that, because there are other people employed in the system. Yeah. No.
Do you think that Northern Territory Government should have given you more funding? Like, do you find that you have a lot more work and not enough interpreters to do it?
I think it's a very unique service, and I think that our staff, I know that our staff, and I'm very proud to say this, are fantastic and are doing an enormous job at all times. So yeah, I think they're doing a fantastic job. And I think we're always, as a team, always looking for how we can collaborate with others and how we can always improve our business. Because one of our jobs is to constantly review what we're doing and how we can make it better. And often, that's why you want to have as many staff feeding into that as possible, because good ideas come from everywhere. So, questions for you. What should you do when you book an interpreter? Yeah, classify the language. Don't say you got an Aboriginal person, can we get somebody who speaks Aboriginal? Anything else? As much detail as possible, as much notice as possible, gender, that sort of thing. Yeah, sorry. What are we doing here? What are two things you should do before the interpreting begins? Find a quiet place if you can, yeah. Sit in a triangle if you can, and sometimes you can't because there's no seating, there's no... Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. And, sometimes you've just got limited space, it's busy, lots of human traffic. Introduce each other, give a bit of background to the interpreter about the situation. Those sorts of things. So if you're using an interpreter to talk to a language speaker, to interpret for a language speaker, what's one of the things that you should probably consider? Who do you focus on? Who do you look at? The language speaker, yeah? And some of our interpreters, if somebody bangs a table and says, "Ah," I can't do the angry voice very well, but they do the same to make sure the message is the same. Swearing. And some interpreters aren't confident doing that yet, but some of them will, and they tell me that that's really important so that the person understands the context. So yeah, I'm running out of time, so I'm not even going to bother with those questions anymore because my time is over. But yeah, thank you everybody, and it's a pleasure to be here today, and yeah, hope you got something out of it.
Well, thank you very much, Curtis, for being here today. That was a very, very good presentation, I think. And I hope you all enjoyed it. I'm glad that you've come to support this today. And I'm sure we're all going to go away with a little bit more information and knowledge about the interpreter service. I like the idea what you just said with the last comment about sometimes you've got to demonstrate and do that. I think I'll start using that tactic here. And I might get my message across. Yeah. Because I speak the same language, but it's not going in here. And there's no memory, people don't remember what to say. So that's a good hint. But yeah, so thank you very much. We did have to move to a different building today because building 10 didn't have air conditioning. But that's where we're heading back to have a sandwich, and hope you can join us at that. Have a sandwich with us and a little bit more of an informal chat together. Maybe we can make you a cup of tea, and
We can't stay.
oh,
Because as much as we'd love to, because we had some, there were some issues arise in our office today.
Yes.
that we need to sort of get back for.
But yes, so thanks once again, and thanks for supporting the seminar series. We've got one more to go in next month, which will be October, I think. Yeah. And that's with the Skinny Fish Music Mob. Emmanuel's sort of been chasing up on that. But I personally want to thank the seminar team, especially Adam, Emmanuel, Derek even helps out there. I mean, there's a little team of us, you know, and it's really good that you supported us too. And I just want to thank the online group that are listening in for being part of the seminar too. And of course you can see this all online as well. It's recorded. So I say this. Okay, thanks again and mum up.